Anyway, we'll pick up in 1935. Now, the 1930s, the Depression years of the 1930s and the war years of the 1940s were difficult times for First Unitarian Church, as they were for pretty much everyone in Sioux City and around the nation. But we're going, so the Reverends James DeHere and his wife Elizabeth left in 1935, which was the 50th anniversary year of the church. And they were replaced by Reverend Henry Adler. And Adler was born in Lincolnshire, England, but he had immigrated to the United States in 1912 and had attended the Meadville, Pennsylvania Theological School. Now, earlier in his career, he had been a lay pastor in the English Wesleyan Methodist Church and had preached to a couple of churches in England and also in Canada. But he converted to Unitarianism in Canada and preached in Dunkirk, New York, and in Canada again, and in Des Moines and in Duluth, Minnesota, before coming to Sioux City in 1935. After he was only in Sioux City for about a year, and then he returned to England and finished his career in Bath, England. Oh, it's not shifting. Oh, there it went. Adler was replaced by Reverend Henry Clark, another native of England, born in London. And he came to the U.S. as a pretty young man in 1885. And he had a very interesting career overall. Clark had one of the more interesting backgrounds of all the ministers who have served First Unitarian Church. He held a Doctor of Divinity degree. I was not able to pin down exactly where he received that, but he was a very learned man. In fact, he spent several decades speaking on what they called the Lyceum and Chautauqua Circuit as a lecturer in all kinds of subjects. He also led the American City Bureau of Chicago as its educational director in the 1920s and 1930s. But he began his preaching career as a traveling evangelist in the Baptist church and served Baptist congregations in Kansas and in Iowa and in Nebraska. But at some point, he converted to Unitarianism and served in that tradition from that point on. Came to Sioux City in 1937 to replace Henry Adler, and it appears that really Sioux City was his first Unitarian congregation, his first and only that he led, and so he was well known in Sioux City as somebody that could speak on a host of topics and was just very interesting as a public speaker. He passed away kind of unexpectedly in 1941, and he was replaced by the Reverend Daniel Sands. Sands was a native of New York, and he had been educated at the University of Rochester in New York, and then at the Rochester Theological Seminary, and later at the Meadville, Pennsylvania Theological School. He had actually a pretty extensive non-ministry career as a social worker. During the 1930s, he worked for the Illinois Emergency Relief Commission and for the Works Progress Administration's Illinois Bureau. But he also preached at Quincy, Illinois, and it was the head of the Illinois Unitarian Service Committee field secretary before coming to Sioux City. Served here during the kind of the early years of World War II before leaving in 1943 to become an administrator with the American Red Cross toward the tail end of World War II. I just wanted to show a little bit about what Sioux City looked like in the 1940s. This is one of my favorite pictures because it was taken in December of 1941, so really just after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and it's a night scene on 4th Street. We're at Jackson Street, looking west toward Nebraska Street, toward the intersection of 4th and Nebraska, and you have all the holiday decorations, and it kind of belies the emergency situation that the country was in at that time. Now, Sioux City during World War II was the home of a very large bomber training base for the U.S. Army Air Corps. The U.S. Army came in purchased what was the very small Sioux City Airport and expanded it into a huge bomber training base. And I have a aerial photo of that facility. Of course, our current Sioux City Airport and Air National Guard facilities are the descendants of that. And so we have a picture here looking to the west over Sergeant Bluff and to over the air base. At the air base, they trained crews in the B-24 Liberator and then in the B-17 Flying Fortress. And here we have a picture of one of the B-17 crews. Here's a picture of the victory parade after the surrender of Japan. This was held in October of 1945, and in this view, we're at 4th and Pierce Streets, looking back to the east, and you can see in the parade, the Boy Scouts are carrying large service flags that have the gold stars of the blue stars and the gold stars indicating the Woodbury County residents that had served in the military during the war, and the gold stars, those that had lost their lives. I mean, just a huge crowd turned out for that. So after Sands left Sioux City, he was replaced by the Reverend Francis Rueland. Rueland was another native of New York, born in Syracuse. He was educated at the University of Chicago and at the Meadville Lombard Theological School after it had moved to the University of Chicago. Sioux City was his first pastorate. He was actually ordained here in October of 1943. And after serving here 3 years, he left and later led congregations at Newburgh, New York, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. After he left the ministry in the early 1950s, he spent the rest of his career engaged in private business pursuits, notably as a quite successful antique dealer. And he was known as an authority on American antiques. The Unitarian Church during these years put out a monthly newsletter that contained all kinds of church-related news, but also different types of writings that people involved with the church would do, and so it was kind of a combination church newsletter slash sort of almost an intellectual journal also. So we have a few copies of these in the museum collection, and they're pretty interesting to look over. Now, after in 1946, there was a little bit of a delay in finding a new pastor, and so an interim pastor came in, Reverend Dr. Arthur Graham, and I wanted to include him because he had quite an interesting career. He only led First Unitarian Church between March and August 1946, but he was born in Worcester, Massachusetts, educated at Clark University in Worcester, and later Tufts College, the Crane Theological School there, and New York University. He had led congregations at Sterling, Massachusetts, and then had served as a U.S. Army chaplain during World War II. Came to Sioux City just briefly during the summer of 1946, and then left and later served congregations at Yonkers, New York, and Oak Ridge, Tennessee, which he led for about 20 years, and then finally finished up his career at Norfolk, Virginia. But when he was in Oak Ridge, was right during the heart of the Civil Rights era, and being in a southern state, he was very prominent in the local Civil Rights movement at Oak Ridge, and comes up in the news if you research newspapers during that time as a leader there. He was awarded a doctorate of sacred theology by Starr King School for the ministry in Berkeley in 1975. Now, one of the longer serving ministers that First Unitarian had was Reverend Dr. John Brigham. And Brigham is noted for leading First Unitarian through a particularly tough era in its history, mostly relating to the burning of the original church building, which we'll get to in a second. But Brigham was born in Concord, Massachusetts, and had attended Tufts College, the Crane Theological School there, and then later Meadville Lombard Theological School in Chicago. and he had led congregations at Castine, Maine, and Billerica, Massachusetts before coming to Sioux City. Led the Sioux City Church from 1946 to 1956, and Brigham was a noted civil rights leader and was the president of Sioux City's NAACP during his time here in Sioux City. When he left Sioux City, he led congregations at Burlington, Iowa, and Rochester, New York, and Quincy, Illinois. Now, a real crisis hit First Unitarian Church in the summer of 1947 when the original church built in 1889 burned under, to a degree, mysterious circumstances. No one ever really determined the cause of the blaze. Fire officials said that it started in the basement of the church and quickly spread to the rest of the structure. It happened at night, and it was in late August. And it really thoroughly destroyed the church, as you'll see in the upcoming photos. Here we have, it took 4 fire department engines and 3 truck companies to kind of stabilize the blaze, although they couldn't save the church. And it also threatened to set Douglas Street on fire because there had just been brand new asphalt paving placed on Douglas Street. And so the fire department was really worried that the whole street was going to go up in flames and maybe catch other homes in the area on fire. And so they had to really work to keep that from happening. Here's a picture of the aftermath, and you can see that the church was fairly well gutted by the fire, and was just, there was no way of salvaging the structure after that. So in the interim, the Jewish Federation of Sioux City offered quarters in what had been Bancroft School between 1935 and 1934. This was at the northwest corner of 11th and Pearl Street, on what today is the Heelan High School campus. And the Jewish Federation offered space so that First Unitarian had a temporary place until they could find more permanent headquarters. And so they were housed there from the summer of 1947 until 1948. In 1948, the First Unitarian Church purchased what had been the Walter Orcutt home. Walter Orcutt was a hardware dealer here in Sioux City, and the house was at the southeast corner of 18th and Grandview Boulevard. House is still there. For a long time, for those of us with the museum, one of our longtime supporters, Maynard Porter, lived in that house, and I believe his wife still does. It was originally built in 1906 by Wallace Swan, and First Unitarian used it as its church until 1954. The 1950s were they were a prosperous time in Sioux City, but with a lot of setbacks as well. And one of them was the polio epidemic of the late 1940s, and particularly in the early 1950s, 1951, 1952. A lot of children in Sioux City were struck with polio, and the wards at St. Joseph Hospital, St. Vincent's, and the Methodist and Lutheran hospitals were full of kids that were being treated for the disease. In August of 1951, Bob Hope came to Sioux City to visit kids that were being treated for polio. We have a great photo of this at St. Joseph's Hospital. Another thing was that there were 2 terrible floods in Sioux City during the 1950s. In 1952, the Missouri River flooded, and it didn't damage Sioux City too bad, but it really hit South Sioux City. And then in June of 1953, the very worst Floyd River flood struck Sioux City. It killed 14 people, did about $23 million in damage to the Floyd River Valley and downtown Sioux City. You can see this was the only one of the Floyd's many floods that really flooded downtown. And this picture was taken on 4th Street, and we're looking to the east from Nebraska Street, and you can see people are almost knee deep in water on 4th Street. So you can get a sense of how bad that flood was. In the 1950s, of course, was the era when Interstate 29 was built through Sioux City. So in this aerial view, we're looking to the west over downtown Sioux City, and you can see along the left side of the image, you can see the newly constructed Interstate 29 running along the southern part of downtown Sioux City. Now, First Unitarian Church actually had grown substantially since the fire in 1947, and was looking for new quarters by 1954. And so in the spring of 1954, the church purchased the home at 2508 Jackson Street, which had been built in 1912 by Mrs. Eugenia Cody, and had been a private residence up to that point. So here we have an image of the house, which of course is still in use. And then the plan was to use the house as part of the church facility, and then to build a chapel connected to it. And so here we have the groundbreaking ceremony in August of 1954, with many of the luminaries of the church. And in the foreground we have Lois Helm breaking the ground for the new chapel. Here we have an architectural drawing by the Sioux City architect Robert Hecker for the new chapel. Unfortunately, the only good picture, or the only picture of this I had, was from a newspaper article, which is a little difficult to see, but you can kind of see how the original plan was laid out. And then finally, we have the interior of the church during the dedication ceremony for the new chapel on the 26th of January, 1955, with Reverend Brigham giving the address. And as one of your members pointed out to me the last time I was here, the stained glass window in the chapel was salvaged from the original church at 10th and Douglas Street. So that's a great connection to the original church building. And you can see it well in this photograph. Now, Reverend Brigham left Sioux City in 1956 and was briefly replaced by a member of the church, Reverend Dr. Roger Bosworth. And I wanted to point Bosworth out because he was another member that had a very interesting overall career. Bosworth was born in Moville, Iowa, and he attended Morningside College, and then he received his theology degree at the Iliff School of Theology in Denver, Colorado. And in his early days as a minister, he was a Universalist minister in Denver and Columbus, Ohio. He also then he switched to Unitarianism and led churches at Atlanta, Georgia, and was the American Unitarian Unitarian Association affiliate pastor. In addition to his ministerial work, he worked as a college professor at the University of Ohio in Athens, Ohio, as a professor of philosophy, and was living in Sioux City when Reverend Brigham left. And he was working as KVTV, which was the first television station in Sioux City. He was working as a newscaster there when he served as the interim pastor at First Unitarian. Reverend Brigham was known as an authority on Middle Eastern affairs, and after World War II, conducted an extensive study tour of the Middle East, Germany, and the United Kingdom, and he lectured before the American Christian Palestine Commission. Reverend Carl Whittier Jr. was the next minister at First Unitarian, born in Providence, Rhode Island. He attended Harvard University and Harvard Divinity School. And he had led the Providence, Rhode Island Unitarian Church before coming to Sioux City, which he served between 1956 and 1960. And after leaving Sioux City, he led congregations in Scituate, Massachusetts, Springfield, Missouri, and Columbus, Ohio. Now, after Reverend Whittier left, the Unitarian Church went almost a year and a half, 2 years without a minister, between mid-1960 and late 1961. And during that period, member Gene Farley was very much a leader of the church and arranged guest speakers and guest ministers, and was very important to keeping the church going on a regular basis. Mrs. Farley was also a teacher in Sioux City. Finally, a permanent minister was found in Reverend Rexford Stizens, who was born in Chicago. He had attended Shimer College in Chicago, and then the Meadville Lombard Theological School on the University of Chicago campus. Sioux City was his first pastorate. He was ordained here in November of 1961. And after leaving Sioux City, he led congregations in Davenport, Iowa, Watertown, Massachusetts, and Long Beach, California. I just wanted to show a few pictures of what was going on in Sioux City during the 1960s. One of the big things was the Floyd River Flood Control Project. After the Great Flood of 1953, there was a real initiative to try to tame the Floyd River. And so in the early 1960s, the Army Corps of Engineers created a new channel for the Floyd River, which we see in this aerial view that ran from 18th Street to the Missouri River. And so in this picture, you can see the new channel being dug across the center of the image, and then you can see the original Floyd channel kind of snaking its way through the bottom of the picture. The other thing that was happening during the 60s was kind of the beginnings of suburbanization in Sioux City, and particularly the movement of business from downtown Sioux City out to the suburban developments. And one of the first big developments was the Bellis Hess Superstore along Highway 75 south of downtown, south and east of downtown. And that opened in 1963. And when that opened, that was one of the largest stores in the entire United States. Reverend Stuyvesant was replaced by the Reverend Philip Silk. Silk was born in Chelmsford, Massachusetts. He had attended Wesleyan University in Middletown, Connecticut, Harvard University, and then the St. Lawrence University Divinity School. He had led a congregation in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania before coming to Sioux City. And after leaving Sioux City, he served a congregation in Wesley Hills, Massachusetts. Now, interestingly, in 1971, Reverend Silk moved to England, to Bradford, West Yorkshire, England, and taught at the Woodhouse Grove School in Bradford, which was is to this day a pretty prominent school in Northern England. After Reverend Silk left, the Unitarian Church went over 2 years without a regular minister. And during that time, member Joanne Soper was very much a leader of the congregation and helped organize interim or guest speakers and such, much as Gene Farley had earlier in the decade. I love this picture with her at the guitar as well. Finally, in 1968, First Unitarian hired Reverend John Colbjordson, and Colbjordson was born in Norway, came to Sioux City, or came to the United States in the 1930s, served in the U.S. Navy during World War II, and as a member of the U.S. Diplomatic Corps in Denmark, and the U.S. Embassy to Denmark in the 1940s. He attended college at Harvard, and at Harvard, he went to Harvard Divinity School and later to George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Before coming to Sioux City, he had led congregations at Sharon, Massachusetts, Williamsville, New York, and Norwell, Massachusetts. And was one of the longer serving ministers at First Unitarian from 1968 to 1975. He was known as a very strong opponent of the Vietnam War, and I wouldn't say it was controversial, but stirred up some. He definitely was a prominent member of the local anti-war movement in Sioux City during his time here. After leaving Sioux City, he led congregations at Chester Depot, Vermont, Springfield, Vermont, and Durham, New Hampshire. Now I want to show a couple images of Sioux City in the later 1960s and early 1970s. Here we have a picture of the block between 5th and 4th Streets on Nebraska Street. And so what you're seeing is the old Capitol Theater in the middle of the block and the Martin department store on the corner. And this, of course, I put this in here because this is where the public museum is today. And so you get a sense of what this would look like. And this is right before the era of what we call urban renewal in Sioux City, where a lot of the older structures were torn down and replaced with newer buildings. One of the kind of controversial moves during urban renewal was to tear down the Martin department store. And this is a image of it being torn down. It was a very well-constructed building. It was difficult to tear down, as you can tell from this photo in 1970. After Reverend Colbjordson left, a couple of members actually led the congregation in 1975 and 1976. Kenneth Zeising, who was a teacher here in Sioux City, and Dr. Richard Evans, who was a professor of education at Morningside College, were essential in keeping the church going on a weekly basis. Finally, in 1976, Reverend Dr. Michael Schuler came to Sioux City to serve as the permanent pastor. He had been born in Dixon, Illinois, and had attended Eckerd College in St. Petersburg, Florida, and the Star King School for the Ministry at Berkeley. And later, he attended Florida State University. He led the Sioux City congregation in 1976 to 1979 and was ordained here in Sioux City. So this was the beginning of his ministerial career. After Sioux City, he served congregations in Binghamton, New York, and Madison, Wisconsin. And in fact, he still, from what I understand, still lives and works in Madison. He's the minister emeritus at a pretty large Unitarian church there. He also holds a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree and is an accomplished artist in addition to his ministerial work. Then we get to Reverend Dr J Atkinson, who was another one of the longer serving ministers for First Unitarian. He was born in Decatur, Indiana. He attended Indiana University and Oregon State University. And early in his career, he was a physics. He was in physics. He holds a bachelor's and master's degree in physics. And really worked in that field before turning to the ministry in the 1970s. Then he attended the University of Chicago Divinity School and the Meadville Lombard Theological School. He came to Sioux City in 1979 and was ordained here in November of that year. While he was in Sioux City, he also served on the adjunct faculty at Morningside College and was the pastor of the church when it celebrated its 100th anniversary in 1985. After leaving Sioux City, Reverend Atkinson has served congregations at Davis, California, Auburn, California, and Studio City, California. He still lives in Studio City, California, and serves as a research scholar at the Star King School for the Ministry at Berkeley. And so just somebody that's had a very interesting career overall. And here we have a picture of a coffee house music and poetry series that the church hosted in the late 1970s, early 1980s that drew members of the church, but also just members of the community who were interested in that program. Here's a picture of Reverend Atkinson putting out a sign on the church house front porch celebrating the 100th anniversary of First Unitarian in 1985. Reverend Atkinson was replaced by Reverend Penelope Anderson Binger in 1986. Reverend Binger was born in Omaha, Nebraska. She attended Cornell College at Mount Vernon, Iowa, and graduated from the University of Nebraska. And for a good portion of her life, she managed 3 Cedar Rapids, Iowa bookstores while raising 6 children before getting into the ministry. And when she got into the ministry in the 1970s, she attended the Star King School for the Ministry at Berkeley. She led a congregation at San Jose, California, before coming to Sioux City in 1986. And while here in Sioux City, she was very involved in civil rights and social justice issues. She served as the president of the American Association of University Women's Sioux City chapter. She was chair of the Morningside College's Center for Women. She was an organizer of the Iowa Civil Liberties Union's Siouxland chapter. She was founder of the Siouxland Diversity Council and a winner of the 1989 Siouxland Women of Excellence Award. And in the 1970s, before coming to Sioux City, she had served on the Iowa Child Labor Committee and had been appointed by Governor Robert Ray to that. Here we have a great picture of the Siouxland Diversity Coalition, which Reverend Binger had founded. This is a 1995 picture that right to left, Eloise Coltvet, of course, Maria Runquist, another church member, Richard Hayes, and Reverend Binger. So I really like this picture. Yeah. After Reverend Binger retired, eventually, Reverend Dr. Sarah Voss was brought in as consulting minister. Reverend Voss had again, another very interesting career she's had. She was born in Northeast Ohio. She attended Ohio State University and the University of Cincinnati. And she was actually, for a good portion of her career, was a mathematics teacher. But later in her career, went to Meadville Lombard Theological School and got into the ministry. So she had served as associate professor of mathematics at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, and the College of St. Mary in Omaha. But after getting into the ministry, she led congregations at Cedar Rapids and Omaha. And then while living in Omaha, served First Unitarian Church between 1990 and 2006. In addition to that, she also was a leader of the Eastern Regional Math and Science Coalition out of Omaha. After leaving Sioux City, she has worked as a community minister in Omaha and at the Omaha Methodist Hospital contract chaplain. She also works with the Nebraska Office of Dispute Resolution as a family mediator. And she's a pretty noted author and has published several books on mathematics, on religion, and on the relationship between the two. And with that, that's the last of the photos I had. And that brings us up close to the present, not exactly to the present, but your church is still going strong despite the difficult times. And I really want to thank Shannon for inviting me to do this. And I've enjoyed this experience. Thank you.
Okay, so Matt, thank you so much.